Hello, good afternoon. And today is joining us our economist, Mr. Eric Ortega Urita, who holds a master's degree from the London School of Economics, obviously in economics, and also a BA in economics from Tecnológico de Monterrey from Mexico. Eric, thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and with all of you.
Thank you. And we wanted to ask you about a very hot topic of today, and it's the crisis in Argentina. Could you tell us more about it?
Yes, of course. Argentina has been always a very interesting country. And as you know, Argentina was among the richest countries during the first part of the 20th century. And you know that it had had a lot of problems since the 70s. And we have that after a long history of economic and political instability from the 70s onwards, we have that it was marked by periods of hyperinflation in the 80s. Also, Argentina has a banking collapse in 1982 and a bailout to private sector, and we have military coups in the 70s. And we have that Argentina finally achieved the consensus to implement substantial economic reforms in the early 90s. It was with Carlos Saúl Menem in the 90s precisely, and with the minister Domingo Felipe Cavallo, that Argentina adopted the convertibility plan. In this plan, it resulted in a macroeconomic stability and allowed the introduction to free market reforms, such as the ones done in Mexico in the 80s, Argentina done in the 90s during Carlos Saúl Menem, such as financial and trade liberalization in the 90s with the addition into Mercosur, as well as the regulation and privatization were among the first economic reforms done by Carlos Saúl Menem. And it was a huge economic success during the 90s, but we have that by 1997, inflation had fallen from 5,000% per year in the late 80s until around 10% in 1997. And GDP was growing, and also we have that an annual average of increase of foreign investment. And we have that country risk premium ranged from 3 to 5%. Unfortunately, macroeconomic conditions began to change in 1997. We have the East Asia crisis, as you remember, in that year. And in 1998, we have the Russian crisis that affected all the emerging markets. And finally, in the 1997, we have the Samba effect, the crisis in Brazil. And obviously, all these events affected Argentina. And then we are going to explain what were the causes of the Argentinian crisis of 2001. The first one was precisely this convertibility plan. We have that the exchange ratio was pegged to the dollar. 1 Argentinian peso was equal to $1. Unfortunately, with the crisis in Brazil, that is the main partner from Argentina, we have that the trade balance account suffered problems. I mean, it have an important deficit because, as you know, Brazil devaluated its currency and then their exports gained competitiveness. Unfortunately to Argentina, this represented an overflow of exports from Brazil to Argentina, and Argentina began to suffer from a current account crisis. And precisely this was more evident in 2000 and 2001. And the second main problem in Argentina was a fiscal imbalance. We have that Argentina began to lend money to sustain their level of expenditure. We have that the level of the Argentinian debt reached 50% of their GDP, and that they began to have troubles to pay the interest of this debt. And consequently, we have a perfect storm in Argentina in 2001. And also it was a year in which we have elections. We have that De la Rua was elected as president, and he had to change the Minister of Economy, and finally he returned, or he decided to design Cavallo once again as the Minister of the Economy. Cavallo proposed a competitiveness plan in which they wanted to improve the economic growth of Argentina, but it was a failure. And finally, as you know, on December 20 of 2001, we have that Argentina has a complete bailout with the International Monetary Fund, and we have that they decided to impose control on in their exchange rates and in the deposits of the people, known as El Corralito. And we have that this was a crisis in Argentina. We have people protesting in the streets with the known as cacerolazo, and doing a lot of civil unrest. Unfortunately, Argentina bailed out their debt with the International Monetary Fund and have one of the most deep crises in the modern era in 2001 and 2002. And finally, Argentina had to follow all the advices done by the International Monetary Fund. And what we have is that Argentinian people suffered a lot. We have that many of their deposits were frozen. They were unable to obtain their deposits, and they lost an important part of their savings. The main thought of this crisis is that the convertibility plan was a failure. And what most economists agree, some of them such as Joseph Stiglitz in his book Globalization and its Discontents, is that Argentina made a mistake doing this convertibility with the United States. Many of them argue that Argentina should follow this convertibility maybe with Australia or other country where they have the same structure of exports. I mean, Argentina is a primary food export country, such as Australia, in the sense of wheat or cotton or other agricultural or products. So it was important to have a convertibility with an exchange rate that have a similar current account. And unfortunately, they did with the US, and they have very different economies. And the second one is the fiscal mismanagement of Argentina, that it seems to be that something endemic in Latin American countries. But it's important, the main recipe is precisely to increase the fiscal decentralization into the states, and also to ensure that you have a higher rate, a higher efficiency on taxes. And this is precisely what Danny Rodrik, in his book, One Economy, Many Recipes, says, that it's very important to have a strong collective base of taxes in order to have or to avoid this fiscal crisis. And finally, well, Argentina has to improve their inequality. As Branko Milanovic says, one important issue is the distribution of inequality. I mean, more equal countries tend to grow more, and they have more resilience in the crisis, according to Branko Milanovic. So one important issue is to improve the economic equality in Argentina. And precisely, and also Amartya Sen also talk us about the economic inequality. And so it's important to have low levels of economic inequality in order to achieve not only efficiency, but also equity in economic issues. Well, that was a very brief, some ideas about the economic crisis in Argentina. And it was really a pleasure to be with you, and hope we have more time to discuss in depth all these ideas. Thank you very much.
It has been totally a pleasure. Thank you to you. So, goodbye.